Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob. In today's video, I wanted to do another Dungeon Master video. I haven't done many lately. We did have one on running high-level campaigns, but that was really the only one recently. And I feel like I've been kind of neglecting the Dungeon Masters. So I'm going to do a couple of videos, one on like themes and narratives, and then one more on like NPCs and having really good villains. And I'm by no means the expert on either of these subjects, but I have had some really good villains over the years, and hopefully I can take what I've learned from that. But today's video we're going to be talking about themes or like grand narratives, and by that I mean things like good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, order versus chaos, these types of ideas. And the reason I like having these kind of grand narratives in my game is, number one, it helps to keep the game kind of on track, because I know on a broad, overreaching level what the game is supposed to be about, and then what kind of themes I can emphasize. Number two, it kind of gives you like a philosophical bent to your game, which helps your game to seem a lot more deep and sophisticated to the players than maybe it actually is. And that, in my opinion, is all for the good. So, if you look at, we'll start with good versus evil, and even though this is one of the most played out and overused, it's kind of the classic for a reason. Now, I do have some problems with the idea of good versus evil, because I think that in a role-playing game, I want there to be choices for the players. And in good versus evil, it's a pretty binary choice, and 95% of the time, the players are probably going to choose good, unless they're, just a bunch of murder hobos. In which case, they're going to choose evil 95% of the time. Either way, it's not much of a real choice. You kind of know what the players are supposed to do, and the players kind of know that too. However, it is one of the most classic themes of all time, and it's worked very well in some of my favorite movies and stories. You look at things like Star Wars, especially the original Star Wars movie, like A New Hope, because that is a very, the Empire is just pure evil. They built this giant space station the size of a small moon, and now they're just going to start blowing up planets. In fact, they blow up the peaceful planet of Alderaan for no reason other than just to prove they can, when the princess already told them, although she lied, but she already told them the information they were looking for, at least they thought so. They blew the planet up anyway. They are just pure evil. We find out that Darth Vader hunted down and killed this noble order of knights, the Jedi, just betrayed and murdered them all. As the story goes on to some of the later movies, we start getting a little more nuance, there's more shades of gray, but especially in that first movie, A New Hope, it's very black and white. The rebels are the good guys, the Empire are the bad guys. And it works. Star Wars still holds up today, and it's still an amazing movie. In fact, the original trilogy are one of my favorite movie series of all time, even now, even with prequels and Disney movies kind of ruining the bunch. I still love the original trilogy. So I think the good versus evil is something that works very well. If you haven't tried experimenting with a lot of grand narratives, it's just kind of the automatic first choice. However, I think some of these others are a little more interesting, and they tend to be a little more narrow in their scope, which I think helps a lot. So let's talk about order versus chaos. Now, on the surface, order versus chaos might sound a lot like good versus evil. After all, chaos is destruction, and therefore it's evil, and order is, civilization and progress, and therefore it's good. However, I think that the Eternal Champion books by Michael Moorcock, and I mean pretty much all the Eternal Champion books, like the books of Corum, Elric, Hawkmoon, they all deal with this idea of the struggle between order and chaos. And these are exemplified by the gods of order and the gods of chaos. But there's also a third force, which is the balance, and that's exemplified by the Ruin Staff. Now, one thing that Michael Moorcock makes very clear in his books is that both order and chaos are actually destructive to humanity. Chaos is very visibly destructive to humanity, and chaos tends to just be very gluttonous and has excesses. It doesn't really care about the grand scheme of things. It just wants power and it wants it all. Order might be a little more reasonable, but order taken to its conclusion also leads to complete stagnation. It's like a perfect snow globe, but you're not allowed to touch it or shake it, because that would introduce chaos into the mix. I mean, those snow crystal things could fall in different places next time. The idea of order is that nothing can be allowed to change, and taken to its extreme conclusions, which the gods of order are willing to do, of course, because you might not have any chaos, then it means that nothing can change at all. You can't have more births, deaths, nothing. Like everything just has to exist in a perfect stasis. And this is not good for human life either. And so the real idea is that players might not think about it at first, but the truth is neither side can really be allowed to win a complete total victory. And the balance always has to be maintained somewhere in the middle. And maybe things on the scale weigh more to one side or more than the other, but it can never be allowed to go all one side or all the other. There always has to be elements of each. And in the Elric books, when the gods of chaos are finally defeated and destroyed and the gods of order now rule, Stormbringer remains as the one element of chaos still left in that universe, because there has to be something there to at least maintain some semblance of balance. And I really like that idea. And now you're looking at 3 choices: it's order, chaos, and balance. And I like the idea that players could start out in the service of order and then realize that maybe this isn't the right path either, and it kind of allows you to get a little more philosophical and kind of move the players in a different direction. In fact, I don't want to talk too much about order versus chaos. I think you get the idea. But there is one pretty funny part in the first trilogy of Corum books where Corum is actually in service of the gods of order, and he ends up finding this dead god or lost god named Quill. And Quill is so ancient that even the gods of order and chaos think that he's just a legend. So they don't believe that it's really Quill. Quill goes to fight the gods of chaos, and Corum's like, "Oh no, man, you can't win. Like there's dozens of these gods and millions of followers in their army. All these creatures that serve him and everything." And Quill's like, "Well, I got my brother with me. We'll be fine, But you should probably get out of here." So he teleports Corum out, and then later he pops in and come visit Corum, and he's like, "So good news. We killed all the gods of chaos and all their armies and everything else." And Corum's like, "Oh, this is awesome. I can't wait to tell Lord Ackroyd of Law and Order that you guys have won, and now the gods of order can rule again." And Quill's like, "Ooh, we kind of killed all the gods of order too, just to be safe." And Corum's like, "What? Why would you do that?" And he's like, "Well, they're not really any better for you long term anyway." And I just thought it was really funny that, they're just like, "Yeah, you didn't tell us to kill the gods of order, but we just figured we'd do you a favor and take them out for you anyways." So that's order versus chaos, and I like that a lot because I think that good and evil are very clear choices too. Order and chaos is a little more murky, and I think that in a role-playing game, in a movie, good versus evil is probably a better narrative. In a role-playing game where it's about player choice and player decisions, I think order versus chaos generally works better. Another one is freedom versus tyranny, and this is one I really like. And I think if you look at the story of Robin Hood, this is one of the best examples because there's a couple things going on here. You also have this idea of this golden age, which was represented by good King Richard. But then Richard goes to the Crusades. His evil brother, the tyrant Prince John, takes over, and he begins to rule the kingdom. And you have the Sheriff of Nottingham, who of course is the main obstacle for Robin Hood. And on the surface, you might think the story is about Robin Hood versus the Sheriff, which is most of what it is. But behind that, you have this idea that the rule of law, once represented by good King Richard, which used to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, has now been perverted. And now the innocent are punished and the guilty are protected. And the sheriff is the representation of this tyrant, the prince, and he does the prince's will. And so justice has been lost. But there's also this idea that there was this golden age which we used to live in where things were good, and sure, there was some hardship here and there, but for the most part, things were fair and just. And now that's been done away with, and we've entered this dark age. And Robin Hood is this representation of justice, but he's like Batman. He's justice outside the law because the law has become perverse. And I really like that idea. And like I said, the whole struggle of, freedom versus tyranny, Braveheart's still one of my favorite movies of all time as well. And just a great movie dealing with that kind of subject too. Because if Longshanks would have just left the poor innocent noble Scots alone, they would have just lived on their farms in the middle of nowhere and no one would have cared. But has to rule the whole of his own island and has to give lords the right to breed with all the Scottish women on their wedding night. And, just things like that. In fact, England even outlawed kilts at one point. That wasn't under Longshanks, but they did it just because the new Scots liked wearing kilts, just to be a bunch of jerks. So then you get the conflict of the story, which essentially is freedom versus slavery, or freedom versus tyranny. And that can be a very fun mechanic, because the idea that the players are outside the law and are operating in a just manner is very, very cool to me. It means that you're like these, rebel type freedom fighters, and that, like, in a case of good versus evil, a lot of times players can appeal to, the idea that, well, we're serving the good. But in the case of this, like tyranny through the law versus freedom, the players can't say, like, well, hey, we're doing what's right as much, because the law is against them. And in a lot of people's minds, if that's legal, then that's what's right. And they might not even like it, they might disagree with it, but a lot of people don't want to go against the law or go against the establishment. That's just the way it is. And I think that adds a different dynamic to your game. I kind of hinted at this one already, but the idea of a golden age versus like the dark age, and something that goes along with this can even be like the cyclical nature of ages. If you look at the Lord of the Rings, there's very distinct ages, right? You have the Age of Elves, you have the Age of Men, you have like all these different eras, and I mean, you have the, like, even the time period when the Lord of the Rings itself takes place in. Really, the One Ring gets discovered again, Sauron wakes up, the ring wraiths begin to hunt for the ring, and that's the representation of this dark age that has come upon him. And it's mirrored everywhere. You have like the rise of people like Grima Wormtongue speaking like poison into the ears of his king, and then you have other kings that are like going mad in different areas, and you have people like using the Palantirs to try to see what's happening, but Sauron's like corrupting their vision, so they only see all the like depressing defeats and everything that's going bad. They never see any of the good that's still happening. And you just have this general like darkening of the world, and that's kind of a cool theme, and I really like it. The Wheel of Time books approach things slightly differently. It's a similar idea. We had like the Age of Legends and things like that, but the Wheel of Time in those books is a wheel. It is a circle, and what was will come again. And so you have this idea that in their world, the greatest hero who'd ever lived was this guy named Lews Therin, the dragon. And he and his 100 companions managed to seal the Dark One, which was their world's version of Satan, basically, into this magical prison that he originally, the Dark One had been in prison, but he managed to escape partially. Someone had like drilled a hole into his prison, and Lews Therin and the 100 companions managed to patch the hole and reseal him and save the world. Unfortunately, though, in the process, any of the men in their world who could use magic, they have this thing called the Source, and any of the men who draw on the Source for their power start to go mad. And Lews Therin among them goes completely bonkers over time, kills everyone he ever loved, kills his wife, kills all his friends, wipes out entire cities and I think even continents, and like what they call breaks the world. And he goes from being the greatest hero of all time to being one of the most despised, greatest villains that ever lived, and is responsible for so much like just destruction and carnage that he's almost considered to be like almost as bad as the Dark One himself. And it just kind of reminds me of the Dark Knight. You either die the hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And unfortunately, Lews Therin lived to see himself become the villain. But the story's not about Lews Therin. Lews Therin is this distant historical figure. The story is about Rand al'Thor, this simple farm boy who we discover is the dragon reborn, because time is a circle, and what was will come again. And now Rand begins following the footsteps of Lews Therin and has to try to like reseal the Dark One, essentially, as the Dark One begins to break loose again. And it gets a little more complicated than that, but one of the things that I find interesting about it is this idea that will Rand, because he starts to go mad as well, and so there's this question in the reader's mind, I don't want to spoil too much, but there's this question in the mind, will he follow in Lews Theran's footprints again? Because we're told that it is a wheel. And while Lews Theran was successful in defeating the Dark One, he also goes mad and destroys the world almost. And will Rand follow in those footsteps as well? Will he win the victory against the Dark One, but go mad? And that is a very interesting type of idea. And things get even more interesting with some of the other philosophical elements that kind of get added to the story as it goes. Excellent books. Kind of drags a little in the middle like 3 or 4 books, just warning you. But start strong, end strong. Maybe skip book 10 entirely, actually just read a summary online. But overall, I can't recommend those books enough. Still some of my favorites of all time. The idea that, so the Golden Age versus barbarism. Another quick example I want to talk about is actually King Arthur and Camelot, right? And again, it's kind of this cyclical idea because Arthur is the once and future king, right? And so you have this Golden Age under the Old Kingdom, but things fall apart, and then we have the prophecy about the sword and the stone, and there's no one who can draw the sword, and so there's really no clear ruler. But Arthur comes along, draws the sword from stone, becomes the King of England, and for the first time in many years, everything is actually united and unified. And then under Arthur, he manages to get Excalibur, we have the Knights of the Round Table, we have, the Quest of the Holy Grail, the destruction of Camelot, and they go through this like real Golden Age, even better than the age of the old king before him, right? And everything's great and glorious, but nothing lasts forever. And of course, some of the Knights of the Round Table begin to betray him. His wife ends up having an affair with one of his best friends. Everything kind of falls apart. Arthur ends up kind of being tricked into having an affair with his half-sister. He didn't know that he was related to her, Morgan Le Fay, or Morgana Le Fay, depending on how you want to say it. And it's actually their son that ends up being the one that actually strikes the killing blow on Arthur. And as everything falls apart and everything goes bad, and Arthur's laying on the battlefield, mortally wounded and bleeding out, he tells Galahad, his most faithful and loyal knight of the Round Table, and one of the only ones still left at this point, to take Excalibur and throw it back in the lake. And I can't remember exactly if Galahad lies to him like 2 or 3 different times, but whatever. The long and short of it is Galahad takes Excalibur, starts riding off, but then he starts thinking, and the thing I like about Galahad, he doesn't do this for selfish reasons. He doesn't think, well, I'm going to keep the sword for myself. He starts thinking about how everything he's worked for and everything he's believed in is falling apart right in front of him. And that Excalibur is like this unifying symbol for all the people. And maybe, now that they've basically won the battle, but Arthur's going to die anyways, but maybe they can still rebuild. Maybe it's not too late. And if he has Excalibur and he has the respect of the people, maybe he can kind of hold on to what's crumbling all around him. And so he comes back to Arthur and tells him he threw the sword in the lake. And Arthur's like, what did you see? And Galahad's like, oh, nothing, just the ripples of the water as the sword sank beneath the lake. And Arthur's like, you didn't throw the sword in, did you? Go back and throw it in. So, like I said, I think it happens a couple times. He lies to him, but eventually he goes back. He throws the sword into the lake, and the Lady of the Lake's hand reaches up, grabs the sword hilt, and pulls it back down under the water. And basically, that's the end of Camelot. And I don't even blame Galahad, because like I said, he did have noble intentions. But again, it's this idea that there was a great age, and then things got dark, and then we have another great age, even better than the one before. But now we're looking at another age of darkness, this age of barbarism where, civilization is basically set back again and crushed, but eventually it'll rise again and become hopefully even better. And I think those make interesting narratives for a story, for the players. The idea that, especially with like prophecies and legends, something that we do a lot in Dungeons & Dragons, and I like building those things in. So, for example, in one game I ran, it was actually a Shadowrun campaign, I had ideas for 3 or 4 major events that I knew were going to happen. And I actually gave one of the players visions of a bunch of these future events. And really, it was just like 4 or 5 different scenes he saw, and those were basically like the only scenes I had planned out. I knew eventually the players were going to run afoul of the Russian mob, and so I was going to have a scene there where the players attacked the Russian mob's castle, and they didn't really know where they were, they didn't know what was happening, but they see the scene and it gave them some information that would be useful for the future. And then there's also a scene of them with some woman they'd never met before, and the player who had the vision had this image that they were in like some sort of spaceship or something, and they were like a rocket going into space, and she's like strapped into this chair next to them, and they're experiencing all the G-force and stuff, and so they'd seen a couple of these scenes, and then when things started to play out, I looked like a genius, because they're like, how did he know all this stuff was going to happen? Well, the truth is, I only had like 5 of these kind of events, and I knew eventually the player's going to have to do this, because that's how they're going to find this crucial information. Eventually, they're going to run into the Russian mob, so I'm going to have a scene for that. And I had some other scenes for other things. Some of them were kind of generic scenes. Like one of it was just of him healing one of the other party members. Because, it's like, well, eventually somebody's going to get injured, and he's going to have to heal them, so I'll just pick this guy. So, once again, it looks like, oh yeah, I remember I had to heal Troy's character. And it's like, yeah, you did, didn't you? Aren't I a genius for knowing that that would happen at some point? So I find that kind of stuff really fun and interesting. And it's a good way to like build kind of layers into your campaign. And like I said, the new players are like, they think you're like 20 steps ahead of them, which is a great feeling as a dungeon master. The last one I wanted to talk about, and one of the big ones, is War versus Peace. And there's an excellent YouTube channel. The guy's name is Matt Colville, and I think that's just the name of his YouTube channel. And he has a series of videos. It's about 80 videos, so I'm not suggesting you watch the whole thing, but it's called Running the Game, and in there he has several videos on politics, and as well as the politics of war. And one thing he talks about is that the idea that peace is actually the exception to human existence, not the rule. If you look at like all the time since World War II, I think the number of days of actual world peace without any fighting somewhere is numbered in like a month or two of total days, right? Like there's like 30 or 40, 50 days of combined world peace through all that time. And when you think about it, World War I was the most horrific war to ever happen in human history. The civilian losses, the loss of military, just the cost in every possible level was so catastrophic that they called it the war to end all wars. And they used weapons like chemical weapons and gas weapons that had never been used before and would kill indiscriminately. And it was so bad they called it the war to end all wars, like I said. And then we have World War II, which is even worse. The civilian death total is way higher. The cost to like militaries is way higher. And we use things like atomic weapons and destroy entire civilian populaces. Like everything we did wrong in World War I, we did 5 times over in World War II. And clearly it wasn't the war to end all wars. And neither was World War II, because we've had mass wars since then. We've had genocides like Rwanda and Cambodia since then. So it's not like we've actually learned any lessons. We just keep doing the same things over and over again. So one thing he talks about is the idea that if there's not war in your world, why isn't there? There should be war somewhere, because that's pretty much always the rule. And maybe it's not the place where the players are. But an interesting idea is that maybe everybody knows war is coming. I think that we have this idea that war just suddenly broke out, but that's very rarely the case. To go back to World War I, after Germany had basically been united as a country for the first time in basically forever, Otto von Bismarck built this huge, elaborate web of peace treaties and alliances, and it is so complicated, even people in Bismarck's day didn't know how he'd done it or even what he'd done it fully. People just kind of looked at it and thought, like, this is insane, huh? But everybody also knew that when Bismarck died, there was really nothing holding it all together anymore. And sure enough, shortly after he died, we have the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and the beginning of World War I. And then World War II was kind of an extension of World War I. And I mean, everybody knew World War II was kind of coming. We tried to have appeasement and everything else. But it's not a coincidence that France and Britain were like, hey, if you invade Poland, it's going to be war. And because they knew that was the next step. And, Hitler had already taken like Czechoslovakia and a bunch of these other countries, and they just kind of knew, okay, like if you go into Poland, we got no choice left. And everybody saw it coming years before it actually started. So I like this idea that your players might be in an area and everybody starts talking, everybody's talking about war. And the player's like, oh, what war? And they're like, well, it's coming. And everybody knows. And then you have this sort of sense of anticipation. And the players can be doing other things or having their adventures and stuff. But every day in the background, that war is getting closer and closer and closer. And maybe the players are trying to prevent the war. Maybe they're going to take part in the war, whatever. But that idea that war is looming is a great backdrop for a story. Look at The Watchmen, for example. Sure, it's about a bunch of dysfunctional superheroes trying to, have lives. But the whole thing is set against this idea of nuclear Armageddon between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And the whole big plot twist is one of the villains trying to basically trick the world into abandoning the idea of nuclear war and binding together as one. And it ends up being a great story. And the nuclear war aspect, while always kind of in the background, ends up being basically the climax of the story and becomes extremely relevant. So while originally it's just a backdrop, it ends up being the story in essence. And I really like that idea. I think that's a great approach for games where you can foreshadow and hint something, and by the time it actually happens, there's been all this buildup and players are like, oh crap, it's actually coming. Whereas if you just start the game and there's already a war, the players might just think, okay, well, my character's on this side or my character's on that side, but they're not really invested in it. They might not know the reasons why, because usually there are two sides to every story, right? And so if they see it coming, they might even be able to go to both different provinces or both sides, both kingdoms, whatever, and hear things from their point of view and be able to say like, hey, maybe we were originally on this guy's side, but now it's kind of seeming like this. Like this story makes a lot more sense, And I think that just adds a lot of interest and dynamics to your story. And again, that doesn't mean that the whole thing should be about war, but it's no coincidence that a lot of the great fantasy literature, from the Lord of the Rings to the Shannara series, not the TV show, of course, obviously I'm talking about the books, but all these things end up having grand battles and mass war. The Wheel of Time books that I mentioned, all of them, they end up having these grand battles towards the end. And, look at the Chronicles of Narnia. The last battle is the name of the entire final book. And I think that makes for a really great, satisfying conclusion to a campaign where everything's been kind of building to this. Then you have the war and, good triumphs over evil or order over chaos or whatever it is, red versus blue, whatever, doesn't really matter. And, you have the big conclusion, and then it gives you a chance to wrap things up nicely and explain who lives and who dies and who's gonna take positions of power now, and kind of have a nice little epilogue to your campaign as well. So I really like that aspect. So anyways, those are my thoughts on it. I love the idea of building these kind of grand narratives or overarching themes into my campaigns. I don't always have the theme from the beginning. Sometimes I just have an idea for a story, and as I start telling that story and running that campaign, certain themes start to manifest themselves to me, where I start thinking, hey, this has been kind of this or this has been kind of that. I remember back when I was in my 20s, I played a lot of a game called Vampire the Masquerade, and myself and another friend designed our own campaign setting for Vegas. Later, White Wolf came up with a Vegas setting, but actually I would say ours was far better, and that's not just me saying that. Ours was phenomenal. It's one of the best settings I've ever made. And we didn't really think about it at the beginning, but we had all these different factions and stuff. And eventually my one friend was like, okay, so why is this all happening in Vegas? And we were kind of talking about it. And we kind of came to this realization that it's because it was this balancing point between good and evil and order and chaos. All four powers were represented by like avatars of those ideals or whatever, right? And that was the battleground between them, because all four of these main core ideas were all being represented. And that made for a cool idea. It wasn't something that we'd originally thought of, but it became part of the campaign. And once it was in our heads, we realized that that was something we really wanted to start exploring more. And I think that that's really where the grand narratives can help to make your campaign better, is once you have this overarching theme or idea, it can help to keep your game back on track. If you start feeling like things are getting kind of lost or wandering, you can bring it back. It also gives you opportunity for some interesting role play in NPCs, where maybe your players don't really care about this kind of stuff, but you can have an NPC who kind of explains, like, you know, why you don't want order to necessarily rule the universe utterly and just put things into a snow globe, right? And the players might not have even had that occur to them, but when you explain it to them, they might be like, hey, that makes a lot of sense. So anyways, those are my thoughts on the video. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment, of course, and I'll see you next time in the dungeon.